You cannot claim to be the United Nations while disregarding the voice of 54 nations. It is not possible.
They said Africa should know its place. Well, it just did. And that place happens to be at the top of the world's agenda. For decades, the same nations that looted Africa's land, stole its gold, and mocked its leaders have sat comfortably in the UN Security Council pretending to speak for humanity. Now, one African voice, William Ruto, has reminded them that the children of the colonized no longer beg for chairs at their table. They're building their own, and soon, the old world will be asking for a seat. So, what's really happening? Let's find out. The United Nations General Assembly Hall has seen its share of rehearsed applause and diplomatic theater, but not this. On that September afternoon, when Kenya's President William Ruto walked up to the marble podium beneath the UN's gold emblem, the air changed. Delegates straightened in their chairs, not out of respect, but out of instinct, the way you tense before a storm. He didn't open with the usual script about shared humanity. He went straight for the jugular. With the calm of a surgeon and the precision of a prosecutor, Ruto declared that the UN Security Council, the supposed guardian of world order, had become a gated club of privilege, one that kept Africa locked outside the door while exploiting its sacrifices inside the battlefield. He spoke without notes, his cadence measured but heavy with restrained fury. A continent of 54 nations, he said, cannot remain an audience in decisions that determine its fate. It wasn't the words alone that landed, it was the weight behind them. For the first time in decades, an African leader didn't sound like he was appealing for inclusion. He sounded like he was announcing the expiry date of hypocrisy. Across the hall, diplomats exchanged glances that said more than any statement could. The representatives of the 5 permanent members, the US, the UK, France, Russia, and China, looked both amused and uneasy. It was the expression of men who had grown used to controlling the narrative, suddenly realizing the narrative had turned against them. Ruto's tone wasn't rebellious, it was clinical. He laid out a sequence of facts so undeniable that they cut through centuries of polite deceit. Africa, he noted, shoulders a third of global peacekeeping missions, provides the minerals that power modern technology, and pays the heaviest human cost of climate disasters, yet remains absent from the council that decides on war, peace, and sanctions. We bear responsibility, he said, without representation. Then he paused, a long silence, deliberate and confrontational. Cameras zoomed in. Somewhere near the front row, a Western diplomat nervously adjusted his tie. Ruto continued, "The Security Council as it stands is not a symbol of global unity, but a fossil of colonial logic, preserved in marble. Reforming it, he warned, is not about expanding membership for cosmetic diversity. It's about saving the UN from its own irrelevance." That line struck deeper than any applause could fill. Because everyone in that room, from the smallest island nation to the largest military power, knew he was right. The UN had become an institution running on moral credit it no longer earned. As he spoke, African delegates sat taller. Their applause wasn't routine, it was recognition, the kind that comes when someone finally says out loud what you've carried in silence for years. When Ruto finished, he didn't wait for approval. He simply stepped back from the microphone, expression unchanged, like a man who had just delivered a verdict rather than a plea. The applause came late, hesitant, and fractured, as if the world was clapping for something it didn't want to admit was true. But outside that hall, the echoes began. Social media feeds across Africa flooded with pride. Newspapers in Europe called it provocative, radical, a warning shot. Yet beneath every headline lay the same uneasy realization that Africa had stopped asking and started dictating terms. And that is where the story truly begins, because the speech was not just an act of courage, it was a mirror held up to the world. The question now is, what kind of world was that mirror reflecting? The mirror Ruto held up that day reflected something ugly, a world still trapped in its colonial skeleton, wrapped in the language of diplomacy. To understand why his words struck such a nerve, we must return to the blueprint that built this inequality in the first place, the post-World War II order. When the United Nations was born in 1945, it came with a promise to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But hidden beneath that noble pledge was a power structure carved by victors, not visionaries. The Security Council, the UN's ultimate chamber of authority, was created not to democratize global peace, but to safeguard the dominance of those who won the war. 5 nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, were handed permanent seats and, more importantly, the veto, the power to stop any global action, regardless of consensus. The rest of the world was given what looked like participation, but functioned like permission. And Africa? Africa wasn't even in the room. Most of its nations were still under colonial rule, their borders drawn by men in European boardrooms who couldn't point them out on a map. By the time independence swept across the continent in the 1950s and 60s, the rules of the game were already locked. The table had been set. Africa was simply expected to bring food but never sit down. That's why Ruto's demand hit so hard, because it questioned not just inequality, but the legitimacy of the foundation itself. The Security Council wasn't outdated by accident. It was designed to stay that way. It is a monument to selective memory, one that remembers Europe's wars but forgets Africa's sacrifices. Over the decades, that imbalance became institutionalized injustice. When conflicts erupted in Africa, it was the same council, dominated by those 5 powers, that decided who deserved intervention and who deserved indifference. When the Democratic Republic of Congo bled, the council held meetings. When Rwanda burned, it debated definitions. When Libya was bombed, it called it peacekeeping. Every decision carried the same invisible signature, one written in the ink of global hierarchy. The veto allowed the powerful to block justice whenever justice threatened their interests. It made moral consistency impossible. A nation could invade one country and face sanctions, while another could do the same and face silence. The council became not a court of law, but a marketplace of influence, where alliances mattered more than truth. And through it all, Africa remained the laboratory of international concern. Its people were subjects of humanitarian experiments, not participants in their design. Even when African nations tried to speak with one voice through the Eswatini Consensus in 2005, which formally demanded 2 permanent and 5 non-permanent seats for Africa, the response was diplomatic applause followed by strategic amnesia. That is why Ruto's speech didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like a revenge of memory. For the first time in generations, an African leader spoke not from a place of inferiority, but from authority grounded in historical truth. He reminded the world that the UN's power structure is a photograph taken in 1945, and photographs don't age well when the world around them changes. But the deeper question remains. If the structure was built to exclude, how did Africa continue to rise despite the door being locked? Because that's where the story becomes more than political, it becomes moral. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. If the world had any sense of fairness left, Africa wouldn't need to demand its place. It would already have it. Because long before the United Nations started calling itself the defender of peace, Africans were already dying for it. That is what gives Ruto's demand its moral gravity. He wasn't asking for power. He was asking for recognition of labor, the unpaid kind. Every major peacekeeping mission that has sustained the UN's credibility for the past 3 decades has Africa written all over it, in uniforms, in blood, and in the soil where those soldiers lie buried. From the Democratic Republic of Congo to Somalia, Mali, and South Sudan, African troops have carried the weight of wars they didn't start and cleaned up after conflicts they didn't cause. When Western powers withdrew from chaotic zones, it was African boots that stayed behind, forming the spine of the African Union Mission in Somalia, the multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in Mali, and others. These weren't acts of charity, they were acts of continental responsibility. The world remembers Rwanda's genocide as a symbol of UN failure. But what it forgets is that when the peacekeepers fled, it was Ugandan and Tanzanian soldiers who pushed through rebel lines to stop the bloodshed. When Haiti collapsed into anarchy, it was Kenya that stepped forward, sending security forces across the ocean to stabilize a nation most of the West had written off. When the Sahel fell prey to insurgency, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad carried the fight alone, without NATO, without pity, without applause. These are not small details. They are the moral foundation of Africa's new assertiveness. Because when the world's most powerful nations use their vetoes to avoid risk, Africa risks everything. When they debate in air-conditioned rooms about intervention frameworks, African mothers bury sons who died implementing them. And yet, the same world that leans on African manpower refuses to extend African decision-making. It's a cruel irony. The soldiers who die under the UN flag have no country among the flag's permanent guardians. But Africa's moral claim doesn't end on the battlefield. It extends into the moral crises the world keeps dodging: climate change, poverty, and economic inequality. When floods sweep across Mozambique or droughts scorch the Horn of Africa, those disasters are not accidents of geography. They are side effects of an industrial greed Africa didn't create. Africa's carbon emissions make up less than 4% of the global total, yet the continent shoulders more than 60% of the impact. That imbalance is not environmental, it's ethical. And still, Africa responds with cooperation, not vengeance. It leads climate adaptation talks, develops green projects, and shoulders debt for problems created elsewhere. So when Ruto spoke of reforming global systems, he wasn't just arguing from political logic. He was appealing to moral evidence, because Africa's credibility isn't inherited from war victories or colonial empires. It's earned from endurance, from rising every time the system tried to flatten it. That endurance is what gives his words weight. It is also what terrifies those who benefit from Africa's silence. Because the moment the continent claims moral ownership of global justice, the world's hierarchies start to wobble. And that's the pivot, the part where moral truth collides with political fear. Because if Africa's moral power keeps rising, the next question isn't whether it deserves a seat at the table. It's whether the table itself can still stand. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. When moral truth collides with political privilege, something has to give. And at the United Nations that week, you could feel the tremor. Ruto's speech didn't just echo across the hall, it reverberated through foreign ministries, embassies, and think tanks from Washington to Brussels. Because beneath the diplomatic politeness, world powers know what moral authority becomes when it gathers momentum: political power. In private conversations after the session, Western diplomats called the speech bold, uncomfortable, and dangerous. The choice of words revealed everything. It wasn't that Ruto had said anything factually wrong, it was that he had stripped away the illusion that global governance was fair. For decades, the West had relied on Africa's patience to keep its order intact. But patience, like empire, eventually expires. Inside the African bloc, something shifted too. Delegates from Ghana, Namibia, and Senegal were seen exchanging nods as Ruto spoke, not out of formality but recognition, the feeling that someone had finally said what they'd rehearsed in silence for years. Even representatives from nations usually cautious in tone, like Egypt and South Africa, found themselves drawn to the gravity of the moment. Because Ruto's speech wasn't just Kenya's declaration, it was Africa's collective whisper becoming a roar. The reaction abroad, however, was more complex. In Paris, analysts worried that France's shrinking footprint in the Sahel and its diplomatic isolation after a string of military coups would worsen if African unity hardened around this demand. In London, policy advisors fretted over the implications for the Commonwealth, a club now looking like a relic of colonial nostalgia in a world where Africa no longer seeks validation. And in Washington, the State Department's tone was cautious. The U.S. acknowledged the need for reform, but quickly sidestepped the topic of veto redistribution, because real equality always comes at a cost. But the quietest room was in Beijing. China, a permanent member itself, didn't dismiss Ruto's statement outright. Instead, it framed it as a legitimate concern deserving constructive dialogue. It wasn't an endorsement, it was a strategy. Beijing sees the shifting winds and understands something Western capitals still resist. Africa is no longer the pawn, it's the board. Every global crisis today, whether in energy, rare minerals, or food security, intersects with Africa. Its lithium powers electric cars, its cobalt fuels digital industries, and its arable land sustains global agriculture. That means the moral argument Ruto made doesn't just appeal to justice, it directly threatens the economic architecture that feeds on Africa's underrepresentation. That's why his call for reform wasn't treated as a political statement, but as a strategic alarm. Because if Africa unites behind that demand, the entire post-war balance of power begins to tilt, and tilt permanently. Already we see the early signs. The African Union's admission to the G20 wasn't charity, it was damage control. Western states hope that symbolic inclusion will pacify real demands for power, but the tide has turned. Africans are no longer impressed by gestures. They want structure, voice, and veto. And here's the irony. The same West that built the UN to prevent another world war may now be watching it fracture under its own hypocrisy. Because no system that preaches democracy abroad while practicing hierarchy inside can survive forever. Ruto's words didn't just challenge the United Nations, they tested its lifespan. Every institution has a moment when truth outweighs tradition, and for the UN, that moment may have just arrived. But the real story isn't about collapse, it's about what rises next. Because when one order begins to decay, a new one quietly takes form. And that's where our story turns now, to the rising shape of that new order, the dawn of Africa's political power. No longer requested, but claimed. Every global order dies quietly, not with an explosion, but with a slow, rhythmic shifting of gravity. And right now, gravity is moving toward Africa. The fallout from Ruto's speech didn't end with applause or controversy. It ended with a continental awakening. The realization that Africa no longer needs to wait for permission to lead. Because while the world debates reform, Africa is already building its own architecture of power. Look around the continent today, and you can see it everywhere, in institutions, in trade routes, in alliances that bypass the old arbiters of legitimacy. From the Pan-African payment and settlement system enabling cross-border trade without dependence on Western currencies, to the BRICS expansion that welcomed African members as equals, the shift isn't theoretical anymore, it's operational. The African Continental Free Trade Area, uniting over 1.3 billion people in a single market, is not just an economic project, it's a declaration of intent. It tells the world that Africa no longer wants to export raw materials and import finished goods. It wants to export value, leadership, and vision. The continent that once supplied the world's wealth is now demanding a share in shaping it. And what's happening is more profound than economics. It's psychological. For centuries, Africans were conditioned to measure success by foreign validation. A loan from the IMF, a nod from Washington, a handshake in Paris. That era is dissolving before our eyes. When Ruto stood at that podium, he wasn't just challenging the Security Council, he was challenging that colonial muscle memory, that instinct to ask instead of assert. Across capitals in Ouagadougou, Lusaka, Dodoma, and Gaborone, leaders are now speaking a new political language, sovereignty without apology. Burkina Faso's Ibrahim Traoré speaks of economic independence built on gold and agriculture, not debt and dependency. Botswana's Duma Boko frames technology and youth as the new liberation struggle. Mozambique's Daniel Chapo ties industrialization to self-determination, while South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa positions Africa as a broker, not a beneficiary, of global partnerships. These aren't isolated ideologies. They're converging into a continental consciousness that refuses to be invisible again. Even global institutions are being forced to pivot. The European Union, once Africa's stern lecturer, now finds itself negotiating trade on African terms. Russia and China, sensing the shift, compete for genuine partnerships rather than patronizing handouts. And the United States, once the loudest voice in African policy, is now playing catch-up, a role reversal unimaginable just a decade ago. But perhaps the most powerful transformation isn't diplomatic, it's emotional. Across the continent, from Nairobi's universities to Dakar's markets, there's a new kind of pride, not performative nationalism, but strategic confidence. Africans are no longer asking, when will the world respect us? They're asking, how can we reshape the world itself? And that shift, subtle, silent, unstoppable, is what frightens the old powers most. Because power isn't just about seats and votes, it's about belief. And Africa finally believes again in its capacity, its destiny, its worth. So, as the curtain falls on the UN's old script, the world stands at a threshold. The institutions that once defined legitimacy now face an Africa that defines it for itself. Ruto's speech was not a rebellion. It was a recalibration of global reality, a message that the 21st century will not be negotiated without Africa's signature on it. The question now isn't whether Africa will lead, it's whether the world is ready to follow, because history has turned the page, and this time, the ink is African. Do you think the UN can survive without giving Africa the power it deserves? Let us know in the comments section. Is the world ready for an Africa that no longer asks, but decides? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.
Deposit photos music.